Okay, now we need to create a controller and our views in order to loop through all of our podcasts on the Explore page or the /podcasts page. So let's go back to our terminal. Let's do a git as to make sure we're on the clean directory, which we are. Let's do a Rails generate controller, and we'll do a podcast controller. Hit enter, and then go to Sublime Text. Let's close out of these files for now. All right, now under controllers, podcast controller. Okay, now on localhost, let's go to /podcasts. We get a routing error. So that should tell you what we need to do next. Open up our routes file and create resources for our podcasts. And we only want resources for both the index and the show. So let's save that, go back and refresh. Now we're getting unknown action index. So let's go back to our podcast controller, do a def index end and refresh. Now we get a template is missing error. So let's create that template. Go under app views. Rails already created a podcast directory for us. So click on that, create a new file. Save as index.html.erb. So if we go to the podcast page in our static template, remember we have the banner and then we loop through all of the podcasts. So what I'm going to do is copy all of this over, and then we will change it over to the embedded Ruby. But for now, let's just go back, refresh. Perfect. So we have the banner showing up as it should with discover your favorite podcasts. Let's write a loop to loop through all of the podcasts. So inside of the UL, what we want to do is do a Ruby tag at podcasts.each do podcast. So what this is going to do is it's going to loop through all of the podcasts, and for each podcast, it's going to print out and run the code within this block. So let's end this before we forget. Now up here, now let's go ahead and change this link. We want to do a link to, and we're going to do a block. So we're going to do link to, well, let's check out the rake routes. So the podcast show, we're going to copy the podcast and path, and then, and then add do, and then close it out. And then again, let's end this before we forget. Then inside of here, we're going to copy the li stuff. Instead of the narwhals podcast, let's change this to podcast.title. And then the episode count we'll just keep as is for now. So let's go ahead and delete all the stuff down here, down to the UL, and see if we get any errors, which we do. Undefined method.each. So that is because we have not defined what at podcast means inside of our controller. So let's do at podcasts equals podcast.all.order, and we'll order by created at in descending order. So let's go and refresh. Okay, so now we get a no routes match error. I think that is because this, instead of podcast path, should just be podcast. Save and refresh. There we go. So this is now looping through all of the podcasts. It's trying to grab an image, but we have not set those up, or we have not set up the paperclip images just yet. Let's try to click on one. So we go to the podcast show page, but we get an unknown action because we have not set that up just yet. So let's take care of that right now. Let's do a def show end, refresh. Now we get a template is missing error. So let's create that template. Under app views podcast, let's create a new file, show.html.erb. And again, let's close out of the static index file and open up the podcast show file. So we have the header. Let's copy everything from the podcast show down. Let's copy the pagination too. Why not? So the show file, let's paste this stuff in here. Make sure to tab it over. Cool, that looks good. Save it and refresh. So the images don't show up. Everything else is just static for now. Let's change this to dynamic @podcast.title. Save and refresh. We'll probably get an error, which we do, undefined method title. And that is because we have not defined what the @podcast is inside of our controller. So in our controller, let's go under the def show. So we're going to do @podcast equals podcast.find, and we're going to find it by the params of :id. Go back and refresh. So now this is the Rocket Ship podcast. If I go back and click on the Narwhals podcast, that will be changed. Okay, so let's go back to the show template, remove this static code, and we are going to do @podcast.description. Go back and refresh. So there's no description for the Narwhals podcast yet. But the Rocket Ship podcast has this in it. Perfect. So we want to do these links a bit different because they may or may not add those links, and that's because a podcast may not have an iTunes account and a podcast may not have a Stitcher account. So we want to write the Ruby code to only show it if it's not blank. So how we're going to do that is opening Ruby tag unless @podcast.itunes.blank ? We will do a link and we'll end that down here. And then the link is going to be the @podcast.itunes. And then I will do the same for the and Stitcher and Podbay. So let's change this to Podbay, this to Stitcher. And then I'm going to copy this and replace it here and here. And then I'll change this to Stitcher and this to Podbay. Save that. Now if we go back and refresh, they're still showing up. But if I go to podcast/edit, podcast/edit, make it plural, and I remove one of the links, for example, if I remove Stitcher and Podbay, enter my password and save it. Now if I go back to Explore, well, that link isn't set up yet. So we'll do podcasts. If I click on the Rocket Ship podcast, now only the iTunes link shows up because only the iTunes link is not blank. And if I go to the Narwhals podcast, nothing shows up because nothing is filled in. All right, next, let's take care of this breadcrumb link. So instead of an Ahref, what I'm going to do is link to podcast path. And then I will just copy this info and paste it in here. So let's save it, go back and see how it looks. Whoops, we need a do block. There we go. Now if I click that, we go back to the podcast page. Perfect. So we don't have any podcast episodes to loop through just yet, but the podcast index, aka the Explore page, and the podcast show page are now set up for the most part. So next thing I want to do is let's fix these links. So if I click Explore, I go to the right place. So on the welcome index, let's change the Explore to a link to tag. link _2. And then we are going to say explore, and we're going to go to, not sure what path, the podcast path. And then let's add a class of button white. There we go. And let's delete this. Let's copy that and do the same for the explore links up here. And let's just remove this class from each of them. Save, go back and refresh. Now if I hit explore, I go to the podcast page. Perfect. Now let's do the same. Let me copy this and go to the application layout. And inside the header, we'll change these links. Perfect. Okay, so let's go to terminal, do a get status. Get status. All right, we'll do a get add dot get s. Okay, get commit. Let's add the message -am. Add podcast controller and views. All right, let's do get s. We're good. Let's do a get push. And let's do a get push Heroku master. Okay, now let's do a Heroku open. Check that out. Now let's click explore. Now we have the first podcast. We only have one user, but that looks good. All right, so in the next video, we are actually going to set up the podcast episodes.